I've always felt slightly underwhelmed by Return of the Jedi. Not that it's a bad movie by any means, but based on what came before it, there's clearly something missing that prevents it from surpassing or even matching A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back in terms of plot, theme, and most importantly, story. With this video, I intend to take an in-depth look at what doesn't work in Return of the Jedi, and then venture possibilities for amending those issues. By doing so, I hope to, at least hypothetically, create a more narratively sound finale to the original Star Wars trilogy. Oh, and also simultaneously eliminate the need for the prequels to exist. But more on that in a little bit. Now, bearing all that in mind, let's fix Return of the Jedi. Okay, right off the bat, we're going to eliminate, in an Alderaan-sized explosion, the whole plot/setting of the second Death Star and the Forest Moon of Endor. I do realize the choice to cut the latter might be a bit more controversial than the former, but hear me out. For starters, getting rid of the second Death Star is a no-brainer. We've already seen it done once in A New Hope, and we don't need to see it done twice. It's more than okay for a story to have repetitions, although those repetitions should be in theme, not in plot. As for the Forest Moon of Endor, it's a fairly similar scenario. We'd already visited a Forest-type planet in the previous two films, Yavin and Dagobah. There just doesn't need to be a third. Plus, as cute as the Ewoks are, they add too much silliness to the weight of the story's drama at this point. We can't go from this to this. As it sort of lessens or cheapens the emotional momentum of the narrative. Also, did George really expect us to believe a tribe of teddy bears helped take down a technologically advanced Imperial army? No, there's no way they could have realistically done that. But they are still really damn cute. Anyway, so how am I going to go about replacing the second Death Star and Endor in my version of the film? Well, it's pretty simple, and we basically get to keep the same climactic action and story beats that are in George's version. We're just going to change the setting to the Imperial capital of Coruscant, and the goal of the rebels to staging a coup d'etat instead of turning off a shield generator. The battle on the ground would now occur in and around the Emperor's palace. The dogfight between X-Wings and TIE fighters would be in the skies above instead of in space, and the confrontation between Luke, Vader, and the Emperor would still take place in a throne room, except it would now be in the throne room. These changes accomplish twofold. We get to see a new type of planet, one completely covered in cityscape, and we get a story involving the rebellion that isn't a plot repetition, yet is a thematic repetition. Our heroes charging into a David versus a Goliath battle like they did in the finale of A New Hope will give us that sense of familiarity we need without doing a complete Death Star retread. And wouldn't it also have just been super cool to see the very heart of the Empire? We never got to see its capital, only various Star Destroyers and the Death Star. Imagine the production design for a Nazi Germany-esque dystopian Coruscant, complete with a memorial for those who died when the Death Star was destroyed, as well as extravagant Imperial propaganda like statues of Palpatine and Vader. Big missed opportunities, in my opinion. Next up on the chopping block is the entire first act of the film, so this would include all the scenes involving the mission to rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Now you might say, but why? It's a fun adventure with our favorite Star Wars heroes. Indeed it is. However, that's all it is. Nothing of consequence happens, as a result of this thread, to the main story's narrative of the rebels trying to take down the Empire. Nor does it really showcase any development of our central characters. The nearly 40-minute sequence is like an overlong prologue we have to sit through before the actual movie begins. Doesn't accomplish anything except bringing Han Solo back into the fold, which I'll say does have to happen, but it needs to occur as a natural part within the story. You see, each beat in a story has to build upon what came before it. This happens, therefore this happens, not this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Otherwise, you risk your story appearing as more of a list of events, rather than a cohesive narrative. But let me feel a possible solution where we would get to keep most of what we know from George's opening act of Return of the Jedi, while having it now obey the cardinal rule of storytelling I just mentioned. So, we open immediately with our main characters and the remaining rebels floating out in the galaxy somewhere. Considering where we last left the rebellion in The Empire Strikes Back, scattered and in shambles, we really need to start by catching up with them at the onset of the film instead of almost an hour into it. So the Rebel Alliance is currently debating about how to proceed in fighting the Empire, and after realizing the level of their desperation, decide to plan the coup d'etat that I talked about in the previous section. One of the first steps in enacting this plan is to find somebody who can sneak them onto Coruscant, to which Luke, Leia, Chewie, and Lando, Leia in particular, see this as a perfect opportunity to pitch rescuing Han Solo, since he is a galaxy-famous smuggler after all. They've wanted to go save Han for some time, however the other leaders of the rebellion view such an operation as a distraction and an unnecessary use of resources that are already scarce. But now here's their chance to save their friend, in which they'd also be servicing the overall goal of the rebellion to bring down the Empire. But their pitch is denied. The other rebel leaders say that they can find a great smuggler without having to partake in such a risky rescue mission. Distraught, and after some brief contemplation, our heroes decide to go rescue Han anyway, and fly off to Jabba's palace. From here, a slightly abridged version of George's Act 1 would play out, although now taking place on Sullust instead of Tatooine. Because we've already seen Tatooine, like I said before, we want to see some new planets. So, following the rescue mission, our heroes would return to the Rebel fleet, only to discover that the Empire had found the fleet in their absence. Most of the ships are destroyed, and the Rebel casualties are high. They then meet with the survivors of the attack and feel guilty as hell for having left their fellow soldiers to face the wrath of the Empire alone. With this scenario, the rescue of Han Solo becomes a necessity to the story, at least from the perspective of our heroes, and has harsh consequences as a result of them briefly steering away from their central goal. Also, after witnessing firsthand the cost of putting personal sentiments ahead of the greater good, opens up the door for more character development. The last big change I'm going to make is to Luke's character. I mean, the Luke we got in George's version is fine, but definitely could have been better. Right away at the start of the film, Luke appears to have already gone through the bulk of his character arc. Suddenly, he's gotten this huge boost in confidence and wisdom within only the supposed 6 months that occurs between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. When last we saw him, he had just endured a terrible defeat. So how did that character growth happen? That's something we as the audience would want to have seen. Thus, in my hypothetical version, we would. Luke would be quite despondent since his duel with Vader, specifically tormented over whether or not the whole "I am your father" reveal was true. This would without a doubt make him feel uncertain and question if he were indeed worthy of being a Jedi Knight. So that's what we would craft the story of the film around. Luke placed in situations which he has to overcome his uncertainties and learn what it does in fact take to be a worthy Jedi. One example could be, Luke is initially unable to bring himself to keep his promise to Yoda that he'd return to complete his training, due to the shame he feels for having left his training in the first place to fight a battle Yoda warned him he'd lose, which he then did end up losing, and quite badly. So now Luke must learn to swallow his pride and humble himself before his master, as a worthy Jedi takes ownership of their failures. By including beats such as that and many others like it, we would be presented with a Luke Skywalker that has the potential for much more emotional depth and a much more defined character arc. Of course, said arc would also be mirrored in what I believe is the coolest alteration in my version of Return of the Jedi, which is to take a page from Lucas's fellow movie brat Francis Ford Coppola and parallel the story of the son with that of the father, a la The Godfather Part 2. Remember earlier how I mentioned I'd eliminate the need for the prequels to exist? Well, here it is. Anakin's fall to the dark side would no longer be chronicled in movies of their own, but rather as flashbacks running alongside the beats of Luke's arc in Return of the Jedi. However, these flashbacks won't be included into the movie just for the sake of telling Vader's backstory. They would be included in order to add a huge layer of tension to Luke's character. As with each flashback, we'd see the eerie similarities between his and Anakin's journeys. From the smaller things like their planet of origin and the older age at which they began their Jedi training, to the bigger things, such as their lack of control over their emotions and a shared internal struggle with their own self-worth. I think with this change, we're left with a much stronger edge-of-the-seat scenario in which the audience believes that Luke could indeed fall to the dark side in the end. And a final note on these flashbacks, they'd more than likely appear as visions in Luke's mind. This would create cleaner editing between the past and present, as well as allow Luke to actually see his father's history, and in turn give him more of a reason to believe that it's possible for Vader to become Anakin again. So anyways, that's all the changes I'd make to Return of the Jedi. And overall, despite the alterations I suggested, I think much of the original film's story remains, at least relatively, intact. Luke seeking to and succeeding in redeeming his father, the rebellion standing triumphant over the Empire, and heck, even action set pieces like the speeder chase would still happen in exactly the same way and for exactly the same reasons. Except it would take place in the city streets of Coruscant instead of the forest moon of Endor. But now I'd like to pass this off to you, the viewers. What do you think I got right? What do you think I got wrong? I've been pondering this hypothetical for a while, and am rather curious to see what other Star Wars fans think of my pitch for this alternate Return of the Jedi. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.